During World War II, tanks were not just heavy weapons, they were mobile fortresses, makeshift shelters, steel traps where 5 men lived, fought and died. Inside, the noise, heat and tension were constant. Outside, mud, cold and explosions covered everything. Each crew member had a clear role, but in combat, anyone had to do everything. There was no room for mistakes. A second of doubt could be the last. Many remember the Panzer as imposing machines, but few know what happened inside. What it meant to go days without sleep, carry shells under enemy fire, or push a tank stuck in the middle of the mud. Behind every precise shot were hours of training, untreated wounds, and decisions that weighed forever. From training to war, how a Panzer crew was forged. Hans von Luck had joined the army right after finishing his studies. He passed the physical tests, then cadet training, and later the first maneuvers. He learned how to give orders, move between trenches, read maps, and manage with minimal resources in the open field. Before being at the front, they taught him how to work with radios, check an engine, and move as a team with other soldiers who also operated armored vehicles. He wore a different uniform than the others, with fewer decorations but more practical. When he became part of a Panzer unit, his first task was to get to know his vehicle well. Each man on the team had a function. One checked the cannon, another the engine, another the tracks. Everything had to be checked before starting. The drills were long. Sometimes they spent hours locked inside the tank without moving, simulating attacks from different sides. The commanders wanted them to react without thinking, to know what to do even if they saw nothing outside the visor. During exercises, they slept inside the armored vehicle. They couldn't go out unless they had permission. They ate in shifts with canned food. Sometimes they didn't even heat the food. It was part of the training, getting used to living like at the front. One of the instructors explained that the greatest enemy of a tank was not another tank, but the lack of communication. If the commander was not clear, the loader missed the shot or the driver stopped where he shouldn't. That's why they trained so much with radios. The first lessons included how to repair minor damage in the middle of combat. They were taught to change a wheel, clean the air filter, remove stuck projectiles, and check the brakes with the engine running. Everything had to be done within minutes. Before each practice, the commander gathered his crew and explained the plan. He told them where the enemy was, why they attacked from one side, and how much time they had to move. No mistakes were allowed. If someone made a mistake, they repeated everything from scratch. The first times they used live ammunition, the noise inside the tank was unbearable. Many covered their ears with cloths, but the commanders insisted they had to get used to the noise, the heat, the smoke. When they started advancing on difficult terrain like mud or snow, the instructors got out on foot and pointed out the spots where the tank could get stuck. The drivers had to memorize the terrain because inside they could only see through small slits. In winter, the tank took time to start. They had to warm the oil with a field stove or crank it up manually. If it didn't work, there was no mission. They couldn't fall behind because a stationary tank was an easy target. During breaks, they cleaned the weapons, checked the radio, and oiled the parts. Sometimes they slept on the bare metal floor, using their jackets as pillows. The tank was their home, their refuge, and their trap. During night maneuvers, the order was to move without lights. They used sights or simply counted the seconds of advance. If a tank got lost, they lit a flare to find it. But that meant repeating the whole exercise. Each soldier in the team had to know the other's roles. If the radio operator fell, the loader had to take his place. If the driver was injured, the gunner replaced him. Everyone trained for all roles. In the days before deployment to the front, they reviewed real situations. What to do if the tank was surrounded, how to escape if hit, how to evacuate a wounded without opening the main hatch. They practiced again and again. The instructors used controlled explosions to simulate attacks. The tank shook. The goal was for the crew not to panic, to keep shooting to maintain radio contact. Sometimes days went by without shooting practice. They just talked, analyzed mistakes, repeated orders and sequences. The goal was to think as one, not as 5 separate men. Before going into combat, they gave a talk about morale. It wasn't a political speech, but a reminder. They were there to cover the infantry, to clear the way, to withstand the first blow. Others' lives depended on them. Von Luck's first destination was Poland. It was no longer a practice. Now they used real ammunition. The tank moved between streets and open fields. The The commander shouted short orders. The driver answered without asking. The gunner kept looking through the sight. In one confrontation, the tank in front was hit. It didn't explode, but was immobilized. The commander ordered to go around it. No one spoke. Everyone knew that could happen to them too. During a pause, they got down to check the tracks. One of the soldiers had a minor wound, but didn't complain. The commander only said, "Quick, this is not a drill." At that moment, everyone understood that what they had practiced for months was now real. Every movement, every mistake, every lost second could cost lives. The following days passed without rest. They slept little, ate when they could. Some armored hay, got stuck in mud or snow. Others ran out of fuel. Sometimes they all pushed the tank with cables and shovels. Von Luck recalled that once they had to go on foot to find a nearby unit. The radio had failed. They advanced through fields under enemy fire, but they knew that if they didn't return with help, the whole squadron would be trapped. On another occasion, the commander had to make a decision in seconds, retreat or advance through a narrow street where snipers were hiding. He chose to advance. Upon reaching the intersection, a shot grazed the turret. The gunner responded without hesitation. When they returned to the temporary base, the tank was dirty, with broken parts and the smell of gunpowder, but it was still working. Every man knew that as long as the engine kept running, they were still useful. The training had paid off. Not to avoid fear, but so fear would not paralyze them. They had learned to keep moving forward, even when everything seemed against them. In the early days of combat, many tanks fell behind due to minor failures. Sometimes it was a loose belt or a problem with the fuel pump. The crew knew they couldn't wait for a mechanic. They had to fix it themselves under rain or fire. If the engine wouldn't start, the commander gave 5 minutes. If they didn't solve it, they had to abandon the vehicle, but no one wanted to leave it. It was their only protection against enemy projectiles. Otto Carius recalled how he had to change the oil filter in the middle of an advance. The engine was losing power. They stopped for a few minutes in a ditch. The loader held the cover while he checked. They moved again before the next bombing arrived. On long trips, one of the worst problems was fatigue. The driver could fall asleep. That's why every so often the commander asked him to switch with another crew member, even if it was uncomfortable. Sometimes the routes were nothing more than trails through trees. The tank had to advance in single file. If the first one stopped, the others got stuck. When that happened, everyone got out to check the terrain. They had to move, no matter if there was mud up to their knees. During the march, the radio operator kept contact with nearby units. Interference was common. If the signal was lost, they used flares, mirrors, or even shouted from the hatch. It was risky, but necessary. The inside of the tank was always dirty. The dust from the roads got in through every crack. Sweat soaked the seats. The smell of oil, metal, and burnt fuel mixed with the smoke from the shots. There was no way to clean it thoroughly. When the tank passed near an explosion, the vibrations shook everything. The crew hit each other, but they didn't stop. They just checked that everyone was okay and moved on. On a mission, Carius had to take control of the cannon after the gunner suffered a cut on his face. While the loader prepared the next shell, he aimed. They fired 3 times before they managed to retreat. The tasks inside the tank became automatic. No one needed explanations. The commander indicated a direction. The driver turned. The operator adjusted the frequency. The loader prepared the shell. The gunner aimed and fired, all within seconds. On the toughest days, they spent more than 12 hours inside without getting out. They only opened the hatch to breathe or throw out empty cartridges. The cold seeped in through the edges of the turret. Their hands went numb, but they couldn't stop. When they reached a resupply point, the rest was short. They filled the tank, cleaned the site, replaced any loose parts, and prepared to go back out. The front was always close. Once, Carius's tank was hit in the rear. It didn't explode, but it damaged the axle. They had to push it with another armored vehicle to a safe area. Meanwhile, they only used the radio to coordinate the movement. The bombings were a constant threat. When they heard the buzzing, they turned off the engine and stayed still. If possible, they covered the tank with branches or tarps. If not, they just waited. Sometimes the attack passed. Sometimes it didn't. Spare parts were scarce. If a part failed, they looked for it in another broken tank. The mechanics improvised with what they had. A brake cable could be replaced with wire, a broken sight with a cut bottle cap. At crossings, the commander had to decide whether to advance, wait, or retreat. There was no margin for error. A wrong street choice could lead to an ambush. That's why foot observers were used, who advanced a few meters ahead of the tank. On one occasion, a snowfall blocked the front sight. The driver continued to navigate using the commander's orders, who used a compass and terrain references. They advanced slowly, seeing only a few meters ahead. Communications with the infantry were basic. They used arm signals or written messages. If the tank had to cover an advance, it stopped at a high point and fired toward enemy positions marked by smoke or shouts. On the eastern front, the cold broke parts. The oil froze, the tracks hardened. Starting the engine took time. Sometimes they set a fire under the tank to warm up the system. It was dangerous, but there was no alternative. One night, the armored vehicle ran out of battery. They couldn't move it. They decided to spend the night inside. They lit a candle and took turns sleeping. Outside, the wind hit the metal like it was going to tear it off. The commander had the duty to stay calm. If he hesitated, everyone felt it. That's why, even if he didn't have answers, he gave clear orders. No one asked if he was sure. They just obeyed. At times, the tank served as refuge for the infantry. They approached during a bombardment, took cover behind the tracks, or requested transport. The commander decided whether to help them or not. The loader was the most exhausted. His task was to load the projectile, close the chamber, and prepare for the next shot. Sometimes he repeated the sequence 50 times in an hour. His arms trembled, but he didn't stop. When there was a pause, they checked everything: ammunition, engine, sights, gears. A poorly adjusted detail could be deadly in the next attack. That's why rest wasn't real rest. There was always something to do. Over time, the crew learned to understand each other without speaking. A gesture, a glance, or a breath was enough to understand what was coming. They had been through everything together. They were no longer 5 men. They were one single body. The new replacements didn't always fit in. Some got scared, others asked too many questions. The old crew watched them silently. They knew the tank didn't accept doubts. You either adapted or you left. On the worst days, there were only 2 options: keep moving forward or stay still. And staying still in the middle of war was the same as being dead. That's why, even with fear, pain, or exhaustion, the tank kept moving. An armored brotherhood, relationships inside the tank. Each tank had 5 soldiers. The commander sat on top, watching everything and giving orders. The gunner was responsible for aiming and shooting. The loader prepared the projectile and loaded it into the chamber. The driver drove. The radio operator sent and received messages. Everyone depended on each other. There was no room for arguments. If one failed, everyone was in danger. That's why, from day one, they trained as a group. They lived together, ate together, slept in the same place. They learned to know each other without speaking. Inside the armored vehicle, there was no privacy. If one got sick, the others saw it. If one was in a bad mood, everyone noticed. They couldn't escape or move away. The tank forced them to live within less than 3 meters. During breaks, some sat on the turret to smoke. Others cleaned their weapons. Sometimes they talked about their homes, other times they said nothing. Silence was part of the group. They didn't need to fill it with words. The commander didn't just give orders. He was also the one who calmed tensions, who decided whether to take a break or eat now or later. If he was fair, they followed him. If he was authoritarian, they distrusted him. Authority didn't come with rank, it came with actions. When there was bombing, the gunner and loader ducked their heads. The driver put his hand on the lever and waited. The operator covered his ears. The commander looked through the sight, searching for the exact moment to move. Everyone knew what to do. No one needed to speak. Sometimes one of the soldiers told bad jokes to break the tension, or they made bets on how long the mission would last. They laughed little, but those jokes helped them breathe. Fights were rare, but they happened. Once, the loader argued with the driver over a poorly executed maneuver. The commander let them talk. Then he said, "Fix it now, or tomorrow you both die." They never argued again. There was respect among them. If one was wounded, they helped without hesitation. If someone couldn't go on, the others covered for him. They knew the next day it could be them needing help. Each one knew the other's gestures. If the operator raised an eyebrow, it meant interference. If the gunner turned his head, there was something outside the sight. If the driver gritted his teeth, the terrain was getting tough. When night fell, they took turns sleeping. 2 rested, 3 kept watch. No need to say who went first. It was already decided in advance. The routine was part of the bond. On days without combat, they shared food. Sometimes there was only hard bread and cold sausages, but they shared it without complaints. If one received a letter, he read it quietly. If he brought cigarettes, he offered one to each comrade. In winter, they slept close to avoid freezing. In summer, they sweated together inside the metal. They took turns opening the hatch to get air. Every minute outside was a gift. When someone got bad news from home, they didn't talk about it. They just passed a canteen, a cigarette, or a piece of bread. Silence was their way of supporting each other. Trust was absolute. If the commander said fire, the gunner didn't hesitate. If the operator shouted advance, the driver didn't ask why. It was an invisible net that held them. There were rituals they always repeated. Before a mission, one would say, "Let's go right." Another would answer, "But we turn left if necessary." It made no sense, but it was their way to prepare. Inside, jokes made them laugh even in tense moments. They gave names to the tracks and talked to the engine as if it were a person. That made them feel part of the tank, not just passengers. Sometimes the tank suffered serious damage. While the mechanics repaired the outside, the crew fixed the inside. The loader cleaned the floor, the gunner checked the sights, the operator adjusted the cables. They didn't need to be told. Once, a shell hit nearby and shook the tank. The operator was bleeding from the forehead. The driver had a twisted shoulder, but they didn't leave. The commander said, "Almost there, stay firm." And they kept going. If one died, no one spoke for hours. The new replacement arrived silently. He took the place of the one who was gone. Someone quickly taught him the basics. The rest kept moving forward. There was no time to mourn. Even if it wasn't said, they looked after each other. If one didn't eat, the others noticed. If one spoke little, they joked with him. If someone had a fever, they took turns covering him. They didn't need orders for that. The tank didn't forgive mistakes. But inside, those 5 men became a single unit. They read each other's gestures, shared fear, and covered each other's backs. The bond they created inside was not broken by time or distance. When a new crew member arrived, they watched him without saying anything. Rank or medals didn't matter. What mattered was whether he knew how to do his job and could handle the pressure. The tank had no room for the weak or the doubtful. During the first hours, the newcomer was tested. The loader would give him a heavier box, the operator would give him the wrong frequency, the driver would brake sharply. It wasn't out of malice. It was to see if he was ready for what was coming. If he endured, they accepted him. If he failed, they replaced him. The group had to work like a machine. If one part didn't fit, everything jammed. And in war, that cost lives. Their communication was simple. Short shouts, hand signals, quick glances. They didn't use long phrases. There was no time. The noise of the engine, the cannon, and the radio left no room for conversation. Sometimes the radio failed. Then the operator wrote messages on short papers and passed them hand to hand. If there was no light, they used a flashlight covered with cloth. The message had to get through, no matter what. In moments of calm, they remembered names of cities, friends, and food. They didn't talk much about the future, only about the day ahead. Every mission could be the last. There were unwritten rules. No one ate alone. No one slept if another was still working. No one left the tank without notice. No one made decisions on their own. Those rules didn't come from the army. They came from themselves. During long repairs, they took turns looking for parts, checking maps, or keeping watch. No one stayed idle. Everyone found something to do. The tank had to be ready as soon as possible. Once, the driver got sick. The gunner took his place. The commander adjusted the route. The loader checked the terrain. Nothing had to be reorganized. They already knew how to move without explanations. On the battlefield, trust was blind. The commander gave a turn signal. The driver did it without asking. The gunner aimed where told. The loader anticipated the shot. The operator knew when to call for reinforcements. When there was no fighting, the tension didn't disappear. It stayed in the air. Any strange noise, any message on the radio could change everything. That's why they were always alert, even when laughing. The routine was hard. Every morning they checked the engine pressure, oil levels. The loader counted the shells. The operator tested the radio. The gunner adjusted the sights. The commander supervised everything. If something failed, they didn't go out. Sometimes a platoon tank went out of service. The crew went to help, not because it was an order, but because they knew tomorrow it could be them who needed help. Respect was earned on the field, not with speeches or talks. If someone crawled under fire to fix a track, they admired him. If he pulled a wounded out of the tank without hesitation, they trusted him. courage was shown through actions. The bond between them was so strong that often just one word was enough to calm a dispute. They knew exactly how far they could push each other. If one was at the limit, they didn't push further. They covered for each other until they recovered. On the longest days, some slept sitting up. Others rested their heads against the tank wall. They took turns keeping watch. If one snored, they would wake him with a light tap. There was no need to speak. Personal stories took a back seat. They could go weeks without knowing each other's last names. It didn't matter. What mattered was whether you knew how to shoot, drive, repair, or communicate. When they reached a resting area, they didn't go their separate ways. They sat together, ate together, slept close. The group stayed united even outside the tank. It was their way to stay strong. At farewells, there were no tears, just a handshake, a short phrase, a shared silence. If someone left due to injuries or transfer, there was no ceremony. They just accepted it and moved on. There were moments when the tank was their only refuge. Outside, artillery was falling, rain or snow was coming down. Inside, it was hot or cold, but at least they were together. They knew that as long as the engine ran, they had a chance. Over time, they no longer needed to think. They acted as an automatic team. Each one knew what came next. Not because someone said it, but because they felt it. The synchronicity was total. In a battle, a projectile hit the tank. The operator was wounded. The loader took his place. The driver continued the route. The commander called for covering fire. The gunner fired without stopping. No one shouted. No one hesitated. When the mission ended, they got down silently. They checked on the wounded. They prepared the armored vehicle for whatever came next. They didn't know if there would be another attack, but they were ready. That group, locked inside a steel box, became inseparable. What they experienced together could not be explained in words. They only understood it among themselves, and that was enough. Inside the beast, combat from a panzer. Inside the tank, the visibility was limited. There were only small slots in the turret or narrow periscopes. The commander used a rotating sight. The gunner had a scope aligned with the barrel. The driver looked through a front slit. The rest could hardly see anything. In combat, that lack of vision complicated everything. The commander had to guide the tank solely by what he could see through his optics. Sometimes he relied on the radio operator, who followed messages from other units, but most decisions were made blindly. The gunner depended entirely on the commander. If the enemy moved, the barrel had to turn within seconds. Every second of delay could mean a direct hit. The loader had to anticipate which projectile was coming, explosive, armor-piercing, or tracer. When the barrel fired, the roar was deafening. The tank vibrated, smoke piled up, the chamber heated. The loader ejected the casing and prepared the next shot. Everything had to be done without speaking, only with gestures and practice. The noise was constant. Not just the engine, but the clatter of the tracks, the shouts outside, enemy gunfire, nearby explosions. Inside the armored vehicle, the sound was amplified. Sometimes ears hurt even with cotton plugs. The heat became unbearable. In summer, the temperature inside the tank exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. Sweat soaked the uniforms. The smell of grease, gunpowder, and fuel filled the air. Breathing became difficult, but the hatch could not be opened in the middle of the fire. Claustrophobia affected the newcomers. Some sweated more than usual, others breathed quickly. The commander looked at them without saying anything. If they couldn't stand it, they did not get back in the tank. The space inside did not forgive fear. During a battle in the east, Otto Carius's tank was surrounded by enemies. They could see nothing beyond a few meters. They only knew they were under fire. The commander shouted coordinates. The gunner turned the turret. The loader loaded the projectile. They fired without thinking. Every movement was part of a chain. If one failed, everything stopped. In close combat, there was no time to correct mistakes. You had to get it right the first time. Sometimes the tank moved between trees or ruined houses. The driver had to advance without seeing. He only followed the commander's instructions, who used the periscope and marked with knocks on the hull. 1 knock to the right, 2 to the left, 3 to stop. When the enemy was close, projectiles bounced off the hull. The sound was dry. Some trembled upon hearing it. Others did not even flinch. They knew that as long as the armor held, they could keep going. The gunner adjusted his aim in seconds. He adjusted the sight according to the distance. The loader followed him. If the barrel jammed, the commander ordered to retreat, but they almost never stopped. In one battle, the radio was overloaded. The operator had to disconnect and work with short messages. The commander kept shouting orders. The loader burned his hand with a hot casing. He did not stop, he just changed hands. The tank floor vibrated with each impact. Tools jumped, casings rolled, oil dripped, the smoke burned the eyes. But the crew kept going as if nothing happened. They had trained for this. Nearby explosions caused the tank to lift slightly. The driver kept moving. If the ground became soft, the track slipped. The commander had to decide whether to continue or veer off. There was no time to think. In another encounter, a grenade fell on the turret. It did not explode. It only left a dent. The operator laughed. The loader told him to stop tempting fate. The commander said nothing. He just kept looking through the sight. The hatches only opened when the danger was over. If someone tried to peek before, they could get shot in the face. That's why many preferred to stay inside. At least inside, they knew what to expect. Moisture accumulated on the armored walls. Sometimes water dripped from the roof. If it was cold, hands stuck to the metal. If it was hot, sweat didn't dry, but no one complained. It was part of the job. The loader had to move his arms quickly but precisely. If he dropped a shell casing, the system could jam. If he loaded the projectile incorrectly, it would damage the barrel. Everything had to be done with eyes wide open and without nerves. In the distance, the commander saw the flash of another enemy tank. He ordered to stop. The gunner aimed. The shot was fired. If it was accurate, the enemy burned. If they missed, the counterattack came. The time between one and the other was seconds. The tank advanced among rubble, smoke, and bodies. They couldn't stop to look. If something got in the way, they pushed it with the tracks. It wasn't out of cruelty, it was out of necessity. In the middle of the fight, concentration was total. No one spoke unnecessarily, the commander observed. The gunner kept his target. The loader prepared the next shot. The driver waited for the order to move. The operator adjusted the radio and listened. The tank turned into a rapid reaction machine. Every second counted. Every gesture could decide whether they stayed alive or became scrap. When the armored vehicle stood still, panic was silent. No shouting. Only the sounds of the engine banging, attempts to start it, short commands. If the engine didn't start, they knew the enemy would be on them in minutes. Otto Carius recounted that on one occasion, during a battle with T-34 tanks, his vehicle took a hit on the turret. It didn't penetrate, but the vibration stunned the gunner. The commander took the sight, adjusted the direction, and shouted at the loader. They fired without pause. At those moments, time stood still. They didn't know if 5 minutes or half an hour had passed. It was all shoot, load, advance, retreat, wait for the next blow. Sometimes there were no visible enemies, only shots. The commander decided where to aim by sound, smoke, or logic. The gunner followed the order without hesitation. If the sight got dirty with mud, the commander used a rag or even his sleeve to clean it. If it broke, they risked using the hatch. The tank couldn't go blind. On difficult terrain, the driver had to have a good touch. If he turned too much, the tank got stuck. If he accelerated suddenly, the track slipped. Every movement was measured, even under pressure. The interior of the armored vehicle was narrow. When it moved, bodies bumped into each other. If someone lost balance, they hit the metal. There were bruises, cuts, burns. No one complained. They just adjusted and kept going. During an operation, the loader cut himself with a broken casing. He bled but didn't stop. The gunner passed him shells with one hand while aiming with the other. The operator used the radio and at the same time wiped the sweat from his forehead. The commander couldn't look back. He only trusted that the others did what they had to. He couldn't waste time. The sight was his only world. Everything else was in the team's hands. Sometimes the tank fired without knowing if the target was destroyed. There was no time to check. If the barrel didn't overheat, they kept firing. When the cannon overheated, they let it cool down. Meanwhile, they moved to a new position. The driver received the order with a pat on the shoulder. He knew he had to advance in a zigzag without stopping. Small bullets didn't penetrate the armor, but sounded like stones hitting a metal box. The rookies flinched when they heard them. The veterans knew that as long as no grenade entered, they were safe. The loader had to anticipate. If the gunner said armor-piercing, he had to have it ready. If he hesitated, they lost seconds. And a second could be the difference between being prey or hunter. The operator adjusted frequencies all the time. If he heard interference, he switched. If he received coordinates, he noted them and passed them quickly. Sometimes he used paper. Other times he said it loud and clear. In combat, spent shells piled up on the floor. If they didn't remove them, they obstructed movement. Some threw them out the hatch, others kept them to count later. Once the tank was caught between two buildings. The commander hesitated. He ordered the turret to turn left. The gunner obeyed. The enemy fired from the right. The turret turned again. They fired without aiming. The projectile went through the wall. The enemy fell. After the fight, the tank was covered in soot, metal debris, and dirt. Inside, everything was dirty, damp, and marked, but it still worked, and that was what mattered. When getting out, no one spoke. They just looked at each other. If everyone was alive, they breathed deeply. If someone didn't get out, the silence lasted longer. The commander noted it. The others didn't ask. Orders were brief. Clean the barrel. Check the engine. Change ammunition. Refuel. No one wasted time. They knew the next battle could come in hours. The tank was their world. From inside, the war was noise, heat, blows, and darkness. But it was also precision, reflexes, trust, and routine. As long as it kept moving, they stayed alive. Feared enemies, facing the T-34s and Shermans. The tank commander knew that facing a T-34 was not the same as fighting infantry. When they saw one, everything changed pace. The tone of voice rose, orders were shorter. The gunner tensed his arms. The loader prepared the armor-piercing shells. The driver slowed down. Nobody breathed more than necessary. On the Eastern Front, Soviet tanks appeared suddenly, crossing through trees or hills. Sometimes they came in groups, other times just one, but even one was dangerous. The T-34 could withstand several hits before stopping. It was fast, hard to see, and difficult to destroy. The first rule was to shoot first. If the enemy managed to aim, it was almost certain they would hit. That's why, upon seeing a T-34, the commander ordered an immediate halt. The gunner adjusted the sight. The loader prepared the correct shell. Everything had to be ready before the other realized. Once, Otto Carius faced 3 T-34s at the same time. His tank was in a high position. He ordered not to move. He waited for the first to turn the turret. At that moment, they fired. The shell pierced the side. The second enemy tank responded, but the shot went over. The gunner turned the turret and fired again. Another direct hit. The third escaped. Fighting Shermans was different. On the Western Front, Allied tanks were slower but appeared in groups. They were accompanied by infantry, artillery, and planes. The German tank not only had to destroy them, but also survive the environment. The Sherman could catch fire with a single well-placed shot, but if there were 5, the problem was different. While one took fire, the others flanked. The strategy was to attack from one side, change position, and repeat. If they stayed in the same place, they were surrounded. Carius said that once in Normandy, his unit destroyed 12 Shermans in less than an hour. It was not luck, it was preparation. They had ready ammunition, good visibility, and camouflaged positions. They fired and moved. They never stayed still more than 2 minutes. On both fronts, speed was key. The German tank had to shoot first, move first, correct first. If the commander hesitated, they lost. If the loader delayed, there was no second shot. If the driver braked poorly, they were exposed. When an enemy shell hit without penetrating, the sound was dry, like a hammer blow. If it penetrated, there was fire, smoke, and screams. The tank filled with gases. Sometimes the fire reached the cartridges. If they didn't get out quickly, they never got out. Fear was real. No one said it, but everyone felt it. Seeing a T-34 at 100 meters was feeling a dry throat. Hearing the roar of a Sherman engine was clenching teeth, but no one talked, they just acted. In a battle in Belarus, von Luck's tank was surprised by a group of T-34s hidden behind a hill. The first enemy shot went over. The commander shouted direction. The gunner fired before the second enemy responded. Then they changed position. They fired again from another angle. That's how they knocked down 2 more. Maneuvering was everything. Shooting from the same place was a mistake. After every shot, the tank had to move, even 10 meters, even just turning. The enemy expected a second shot from the same spot. If they didn't do it, they survived. Armor-piercing shells were the most used against armored targets. The loader had to know which was which. He couldn't make a mistake. If he used an explosive one, it was useless. If he used a hollow one, it could bounce. They had to get the type and timing right. The gunner had to aim at weak points, the sides, the rear, the turret ring. If he hit the front, the shell might not penetrate. If it did, it destroyed everything inside, but that required precision. During an enemy attack, the radio operator had to warn the other tanks. He gave the position, number of enemies, and direction of fire. If he made a mistake, he could send the comrades into a trap. When the fight was close, the commander opened the hatch to see better. It was risky. A bullet could hit him, but it was necessary. From inside, you couldn't see everything. From above, he could decide better. On one occasion, a column of Shermans advanced along a narrow road. Carius's tank was hidden behind some bushes. He waited for the first to pass. Then he fired at the second. When the others retreated, he destroyed the first. That's how they got trapped. The others fell one by one. The tank was not invincible, but with good aim, good command, and coordination, it could resist. The problem was when all failed at the same time. When the loader was late, the gunner hesitated and the commander couldn't see. In those cases, everything ended in seconds. After each fight against enemy tanks, the crew checked everything: the cannon, the sight, the rotation system, the radio. If something didn't work well, it was fixed immediately. There was no time for workshops. Everything had to be done in the field with whatever they had on hand. The remains of enemy tanks were analyzed. The commander got down, looked at the impacts, and pointed out to the crew where each projectile had hit. It was a way to learn, to know if they were aiming well, if the ammunition was correct, if the timing of the shot had been ideal. On one occasion, an enemy shell hit just under the turret. It didn't go through, but left a crack. The commander asked to check the armor. With a flashlight, they saw metal peeling inside. If the next hit was in the same place, the tank could break. Enemy tanks were not all the same. Some T-34s came with reinforced armor. Other Shermans used extra protection with sacks or plates. Each model had a different weakness. Learning them was part of the commander's job. The crew also had to recognize sounds. The T-34 had a particular engine noise different from the Sherman. When they were still in an ambush, the operator listened. If he said distant engine, everyone got ready. If he said multiple engines, they came in a group. If he said heavy engine, it was another type of vehicle. In certain areas of the Eastern Front, Soviet tanks used mass maneuvers. They advanced in a line, one after another. The German strategy was to attack the second or third, not the first. If they destroyed the one in the middle, the rest stopped. Then they could attack from the sides. Otto Carius said that once he destroyed 22 T-34s in a single afternoon. It wasn't because of firepower. It was due to position, camouflage, and speed. Every shot was calculated, every impact precise. They didn't waste a single bullet. On the Western Front, Sherman tanks usually came with air support. When enemy tanks were detected, fighters or bombers also arrived. The crew had to move fast, shoot, and hide. If the sky filled with planes, the armored vehicle didn't last long. In Normandy, the roads were narrow. The Shermans moved along routes. German tanks hid in fields or among hedges. From there, they fired at the first target and then moved. They never stayed in the same position for more than 3 minutes. Direct confrontations were dangerous. If the German tank faced a Sherman head-on, it had to act without hesitation. The commander shouted the target. The gunner adjusted the sight. The loader didn't wait for orders. He already knew which shell to prepare. In a battle near Falaise, a group of Shermans dispersed among houses. The German tank had to shoot between walls, dodging trees and ruins. Sometimes they fired from less than 50 meters. It was like fighting in an alley. When the fight ended, the crew got out with tense bodies. Some wiped sweat, others checked if they were wounded. The commander wrote down what happened, how many shots, how many hits, what damage they had. The armor was checked by hand. They looked for cracks, dents, weak spots. If something didn't look right, they marked it with paint. It was a quick way to identify damage during the next fight. Loaders ended up with exhausted arms. They had loaded dozens of 20-kilogram shells in a few minutes. The gunner had red eyes. The driver had numb feet. Nobody spoke. They just breathed and prepared everything again. Sometimes the commander showed them a sketch with the weak points of the T-34 or Sherman. He pointed out where they had hit and where to aim next time. It was a quick lesson, no long sentences, just facts. They didn't always win the fights. Sometimes they lost a comrade. Sometimes the tank became unusable. In those cases, they walked away silently. The next armored vehicle was already waiting for them. Morale didn't drop because of losing a machine. It dropped if they felt unprepared. That's why they trained every detail. Position, aiming, type of ammunition, movement after firing. Everything was part of a plan that couldn't fail. Fighting enemy tanks wasn't the only battle. but it was the tensest. Because at those moments they knew there was another like them, with a crew inside, with similar orders, with similar fear. The tank wasn't just a weapon, it was their shield, their home, and their attack tool. They cared for it because they knew that without it they were exposed. They didn't respect it out of romanticism. They respected it because it was their only guarantee of coming back alive. Extreme conditions: cold, hunger, fatigue, and mud. Life inside the tank was not just about shooting and maneuvers. The body suffered from within. They slept little, ate poorly, and the cold seeped into their bones. Every day was a challenge to endure a little longer. In winter, the metal froze, hands stuck to the steel, breath formed frost on the visor. The tracks creaked with ice. Sometimes the engine wouldn't start. They had to light a fire under the engine to thaw it. They slept inside the tank, sitting, curled up, one on top of another. If someone snored, no one said a word. If someone moved too much, the others pushed them. The night was long, no one rested fully. Food arrived late or not at all. Sometimes they ate dry bread with fat, other times only cold potatoes. If they were lucky, they got a can of meat. If not, they ate whatever they found. Otto Carius said that in Russia they went 3 days without eating, only melted snow. The driver had to be helped because he couldn't stand. The loader trembled all the time. Still, they did not leave the tank. Mud was another enemy. In spring, the ground became a trap. The tracks sank. The engine roared, but they did not move forward. Sometimes they got stuck for hours. Other times they needed another tank to get out. When it rained, water came in through the seals. It accumulated on the floor. If they didn't remove it with cans or cloths, the interior filled up. Feet were always wet. The smell was a mix of dampness, grease, sweat, and fuel. Fatigue was constant. Some slept with their eyes open. Others talked to themselves. Sometimes the loader accidentally released a shell, or the operator went blank. The commander had to watch every sign of exhaustion. Illnesses came without warning. Fevers, colds, skin infections. No doctors nearby. If someone fell ill, they gave them a blanket and continued. If they didn't get better, they replaced them with someone else. Mud got everywhere. In the gears, in the turret, in the sights. If they didn't clean it daily, the tank stopped working. The loader removed mud with a shovel. The gunner used brushes. Everyone helped. On the Eastern Front, the cold cut the skin, ears bled, fingers turned black. But no one complained. They just rubbed their hands and kept working. The radio operator said he once had to type with wet gloves. The keys stuck. The messages had errors. The commander didn't scold him. He just gave him a blanket. Clothes were not enough. They used the same ones for weeks. If they got wet, they took days to dry. They slept with their uniforms on. Sometimes they used them as pillows, sometimes as blankets. When there was a pause, they took turns going out and stretching. The fresh air hurt their faces, but they preferred it to being confined. Even with the risk of snipers, they went out for a moment, took a breath, and returned. The commander had to watch that no one got worse. If someone stuttered, he changed their post. If someone fell asleep while driving, he made them breathe. No one was replaceable, but everyone could fail. The long nights felt endless. Outside, everything was dark and cold. Inside, only the hum of the engine and the smell of metal. If they ran out of fuel, the cold would cut like a knife. Otto Carius wrote that once the tank stood still for 3 days in a forest, waiting for the order to move forward. No fire, no food, with the hatch closed. They only went out in turns to urinate. The rest of the time they stayed still, silent. During snowstorms, the tank would be covered in minutes. If they didn't constantly clean the hatch, it would freeze shut. Once closed from the outside, they couldn't get out. They used shovels, gloves, even empty cans to clear the entrance. The driver had to keep the engine running to prevent it from freezing, but they couldn't always do it. If the engine noise caught the enemy's attention, they had to turn it off. Then the cold came in without stopping. The operator said that on those nights, silence was worse than gunfire. Only the crunch of ice, the wind, and the creak of metal when someone moved could be heard. No one spoke. They just waited for the night to pass. When supplies didn't arrive, they ate what they found in abandoned houses. Frozen carrots, moldy bread, rainwater. Sometimes they found a dead animal. If it wasn't rotten, they cooked it. The commander knew when to push the group and when to stop. If he saw someone couldn't go on, he ordered a rest, even if only for 10 minutes. Sometimes just taking off gloves, rubbing hands, and getting back in was enough. On long marches, the tank moved for hours, no breaks. If someone needed to urinate, they did it in a bottle. If someone was hungry, they ate with one hand and worked with the other. The pace didn't stop. Wet boots caused wounds. The loader had cracked heels. The gunner had blistered fingers. Sometimes they wrapped their feet with rags or put paper around their ankles. Nothing helped completely. The commander slept in intervals, 15 minutes here, 10 there. Always with one ear on the radio. If an order came, he had to be ready. If a shot was fired, he had to react. In the mud, the tank became a trap. If it got stuck, they couldn't move forward or backward. The tracks slipped, the engine roared, the earth swallowed them. In those cases, everyone got out and pushed. Once, Otto Carrier said they spent 8 hours trying to get the tank out of the mud. They used logs, stones, metal plates. Nothing worked. Until another armored vehicle pulled them with a chain, all covered in mud, even their eyes. The cold, cracked hands hurt when loading ammunition. The loader didn't wear gloves because they slowed him down. His knuckles were broken, the skin torn, but he didn't complain. He just asked for a dry rag. The tank filled with steam inside. If it wasn't ventilated, water dripped from the roof. The gunner used his sleeve to dry the sight. The operator used his cap to clean the radio. Everything was useful. In summer, the problem was different. The heat inside the tank was like an oven. The air didn't circulate. Sweat ran down their backs. The uniform stuck to their bodies. Sometimes they fainted from the heat. Gasoline caused headaches. The smell was everywhere. If someone had an open wound, the burning was unbearable. But they couldn't leave. There was no shelter outside. Only the tank. When night fell, the engine was turned off and everything went silent. Only the breathing of the comrades, the dripping of water, the creaking of metal. The cold rose from the feet and went into the bones. If someone got sick, there were no medicines. Only body heat, cigarettes, a blanket. The commander noted the condition. If it didn't improve in 2 days, they replaced him. Nobody protested, nobody said anything. After weeks in those conditions, the skin cracked, muscles ached, the mind became slow. Some saw things that weren't there, others talked in their sleep. But nobody gave up. The tank had no bathroom. They used cans or took turns going outside. If the enemy was close, they endured. If they couldn't anymore, they moved a few meters away. They came back quickly without talking. The commander had to keep them alert. He repeated the orders. He asked them to clean the weapons, to check the ammunition. It wasn't routine. It was to keep their minds busy. If they thought too much, they broke. Wounds, losses, and the end of the road. In combat, danger gave no warning. 1 second they were ready, the next everything turned into smoke, fire, and confusion. When a projectile hit, the sound was sharp, like a giant slam of a door. If it got inside, you felt pressure on your chest, a blast of heat, and then nothing. The loader was the most at risk. He was near the cannon. If something exploded, he was the first to fall. Many died without a scream. They just collapsed, with their helmet twisted and eyes open. Otto Carrier said that one day, after receiving a side hit, his turret companion got trapped. His legs were stuck under a bent plate. Carrier tried to get him out, but the fire was already starting. He had to choose between pulling him out or closing the hatch. He closed it. The pain of losing someone from the team was dry, without tears. Just a silence that lasted for days. No one mentioned him. No one said, "I'm sorry." They just left that seat empty until another came. When the tank was out of action, they had to run. If the fire reached the ammunition, everything exploded. Some got out in time, others didn't. The commander was always the last to leave the vehicle. Sometimes they found them later, charred and shriveled. The helmet melted, boots still on. It was impossible to recognize them. Only by the tank's serial number did they know who had been inside. The wounds were not always visible. The gunner who no longer reacted, the operator who trembled when turning on the radio, the driver who had nightmares. They all stayed at their posts. No one asked for a break. On one occasion, von Luck mentioned how a friendly tank exploded right in front of them. The fire lit up the interior. The loader stopped moving for minutes. Then he resumed his work as if nothing had happened. But he no longer spoke. The field hospitals were far away. If a crew member was wounded and could walk, they sent him on his own. If not, they left him inside until the mission was over. Only then did they take him out. Serious wounds were treated with bandages, morphine, and luck. If an arm got infected, they cut it off. If a leg bled a lot, they tied it with belts. There were no surgeons, no anesthesia, no time. When someone died, the commander wrote it down: day, time, name, unit. Then they looked for his identification tag. If they didn't find it, they wrote missing. The rest kept working. On the radio, names of other fallen soldiers could be heard. Krauss's tank is not responding. Weber's unit destroyed. Feldman is not answering. Each phrase was a hard blow, but they didn't stop. Otto Carius said that after an ambush, they collected remains of what had been a Panzer IV. They only found half a body. The helmet was 20 meters away. They wrapped him in a blanket, dug with a broken shovel, and buried him behind a destroyed house. There were no ceremonies. Only a hole, an improvised cross, and a tag hanging. If there was time, they wrote the name with a knife. If not, they moved on. At the end of the day, the empty seat weighed more than the shrapnel. The tank kept running. The engine started. But something was missing. The newcomer took that place without asking. He knew not to speak of the previous occupant. Some loaders lasted a day, others weeks. Very few survived more than 6 months. If they endured, it was because they knew when to take cover, how to move, and how to read the commander's silence. As the war neared its end, many tanks were without paint, missing original parts, patched with metal from other vehicles. The armor had patches. The tracks were uneven, but they kept going. Morale was low. Radios announced retreats, losses, confusing orders, but the tank had to keep going out. If there was fuel and ammunition, they fought. If not, they retreated on foot. In the last months, the front was collapsing. The tank no longer advanced with confidence. They went from village to village, expecting an ambush, a mine, a retreat order. There were no offensives anymore, only attempts to hold on a little longer. Units were incomplete. Crew members were missing, parts were missing. Some tanks went out with only 3 men. The loader also acted as operator. The commander used the radio. The gunner slept standing up. The food was scarce, the boots had holes, the hands no longer healed, the wounds were covered with dirty bandages. The cold hurt more than before, but no one talked about surrendering. Otto Carius told that once his tank lost its tracks. The explosion of a mine stopped them. They got out. They had no way to defend themselves. They hid among trees with their personal weapons. That night, they only ate snow. The commander knew the end was near. There was no more gasoline. Only a few cartridges were left. Orders arrived late. The radio announced losses, failures, silences. But the crew did not leave the tank. Some armored vehicles were destroyed by their own men before falling into enemy hands. They placed explosives, set fire, and walked away. They could not allow the enemy to use them. During a retreat, von Luck mentioned that his unit destroyed 5 of their own tanks. They took the radios, weapons, shells, and burned them. No one cried. They just silently watched the fire. The end came without clear warning. One day, there were no more orders. The radio went silent. They didn't know if they should attack or stay still. The commander gathered his team. They decided to wait. If the enemy appeared, they would surrender. When the Allied soldiers arrived, they got out of the tank with their hands up. Some cried. Others just sat in the mud silently. The tank was still warm. The engine was still running, but everything was over. The surrender was not quick. Days passed in camps with little food, without news. They were interrogated. They were asked for names, units, dates. Some remembered nothing. Others invented to get out sooner. The Allies looked at the tanks like rare pieces. They climbed, inspected, took photos. For the crew, it was like seeing someone touch a corpse. That tank had been their home, their shield, their companion. Then came the transport, by trucks, trains, on foot. They were taken to prisoner camps. They slept in tents, barracks on the ground. They were no longer soldiers. Now they were numbers. Otto Carius spent months detained. His legs, back, eyes ached, not from wounds but from accumulated tension. The days were long, the nights eternal. He dreamed of the tank. He woke up soaked in sweat. Some never returned. They died in camps, sick, alone. Others came back years later. They no longer knew how to drive a tank, nor did they want to. They only sought silence. The tank stayed in a field, covered in rust. Over the years, plants surrounded it. Someone used it as a shelter. Another took its parts. Later, no one saw it again. But for those who lived inside, that armored vehicle was not forgotten. It had been warmth, noise, fear, and strength. It had been their world amid chaos. They didn't talk about it, only sometimes in a low voice they said, "I was in a Panzer." And that was enough.